Hi, I'm Los Angeles City Attorney Mike Feuer, and we're here today for an extremely important conversation focused on an issue that is too often under-discussed in our community, and that's the issue of human trafficking. We know that Los Angeles is an epicenter for human trafficking. It's a huge issue here in California, and in fact, if you look at statistics from across the United States, you'd find that California has the most complaints to hotlines about human trafficking. Today, we're going to discuss what it means to refer to human trafficking, what its toll is in our communities, and importantly, how you can help contribute to solutions. July 30th is the day the United Nations recognizes the significance of human trafficking. This discussion today is going to underscore issues that are significant here, but significant throughout the world. So, to get started, I'd like to introduce our participants today, and they are an esteemed group, to be sure. First, I'd like to introduce Mary David. Mary, you want to wave so our audience can see who you are? So, Mary is the Director of Communications for Journey Out. Journey Out is a Los Angeles-based nonprofit. It advocates for women, girls, and victims of trauma. Mary's devoted her life's work to empowering survivors of sexual assault and abuse and human trafficking. She worked as a prosecutor in Baltimore, and there she assisted victims and survivors of sex trafficking and testified on behalf of the Office of the State's Attorney. Mary was a United Nations advisor on women and children's issues, and she's been key in leading the fight against sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Mary, it's very wonderful to have you with us today. You've been such a key figure. We're looking forward to your views. Anh Trong. Anh Trong is currently the supervising attorney of the Sex and Labor Trafficking Unit in my office, the Office of the Los Angeles City Attorney. He chairs the Labor Trafficking Subcommittee of the LA Regional Human Trafficking Task Force, and he's a member of the Asian Pacific Islander Human Trafficking Task Force. Anh has drafted state legislation designed to expand civil abatement laws to address human trafficking, and he's worked to permit local municipal enforcement of human trafficking laws. He has a victim-centered approach to human trafficking. And on behalf of our office, he co-founded Project Beacon. It's a pre-filing diversion program we'll discuss more today that allows Journey Out, Mary's organization, a victim services provider, to screen for victims of human trafficking and to get them appropriate services, including legal services, to handle what are called vacatur petitions, which we'll discuss a little later on. Also, providing early intervention, education, and empowerment for people who are involved in commercial sex, but don't immediately identify themselves as victims. An important conversation we're going to delve more deeply into. Next, we have Rose BASMADZHYAN. Rose is the Chief of Worker Protection and Wage Enforcement within the county's Department of Consumer and Business Affairs. Rose has been with that department for more than 13 years. She joined the department after completing her undergraduate studies, and she's led high-profile investigations and worked with prosecuting agencies to disrupt major fraud rings involved in car title loans and immigration service consultants. Very recently, Rose was tasked with expanding worker protection with the creation of the county's Office of Labor Equity. Welcome, Rose. And finally, we're joined by Chauncey Martorell, who is the founder and executive director of the Thai Community Development Center. The Thai Community Development Center is a nonprofit, community-based organization most notably known for providing culturally sensitive social and legal services, engaging in broad-based community development, advocating for immigrant and workers and human rights, addressing food insecurity and health care access and equity, providing rental counseling and eviction defense, and aiding thousands of the most vulnerable people in our community, including victims of labor and sex trafficking and exploited workers. And, by the way, winning millions of dollars in redress, restitution, and back wages. As you can tell, we have a powerful group of experts today. I'm going to be asking them questions And I'm going to be encouraging them to comment on others' views that are expressed today as we illuminate, as I said, this often under-discussed issue affecting principally women and girls throughout the metropolitan region here in Los Angeles and well beyond. So let me start actually with Chauncey. Chauncey, I'd like you, if you could, to give us a sense of how prevalent labor trafficking is in Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. Labor trafficking is quite prevalent in Los Angeles because we do have an underground economy, a low-wage sector economy, where vulnerable members of our community, like undocumented immigrants, are vulnerable to most egregious forms of exploitation in the workplace, and some of whom happen to be also victims of human trafficking, not just labor exploitation. And so Thai Community Development Center, we have been addressing this scourge, this heinous crime known as human trafficking since 1995. And most of our cases have been labor trafficking cases. We went on to co-found the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking in 1998, and they've been addressing labor trafficking too. Unfortunately, there's a misperception that human trafficking is primarily sex trafficking, but in fact, there is a large number of labor trafficking cases, and they go undetected because people don't understand that the very people who may be serving you and waiting your table could actually be a victim because they are supposedly free and not held in captivity or confined in any way, but in fact they may be indentured servants or caught up in a form of debt peonage, where they are really not allowed to leave their place of employment until they pay off a debt. And then you have this phenomenon called contract labor, which is very close to slavery. It's a form of legalized trafficking or slavery where they come here on guest workers visas, but lo and behold, they end up being confined and stripped of their freedom and forced to work long hours with virtually no pay.
Chauncey, let me actually interrupt you for a second.
So it's pretty prevalent.
Yeah, and I want to mention to our viewers who may not be thinking, and we'll talk about the links between labor and sex trafficking on with you in just a moment. But I want to put this in some very specific context. I remember maybe 30 years ago being contacted by a friend of mine who at that point was a lawyer in West Los Angeles. She mentioned that the daycare person for one of her children's friends had raced over to her house and was pleading for help because this nanny of her neighbor, a person she knew well, the nanny said, "They took my passport, they're keeping me in the basement, I cannot leave, can you please help?" Here in West Los Angeles, in a home where no one would have anticipated that this was what was going on. Now, Anna, I want to use that as a segue because Chauncey referred to, I asked her about labor trafficking, and she referred to what is and isn't human trafficking, labor trafficking versus sex trafficking. Can you please discuss the relationship between labor trafficking and sex trafficking, how the two are the same, how they're related, and what differences our audience might want to know about?
Sure. So we'll start with sort of the idea, conventional wisdom. When you hear human trafficking, most people don't think about labor trafficking. They think about commercial sex trafficking. So that's where somebody through force, fraud, or coercion is, brought into a situation that involves commercial sex. So that's sex trafficking. Now, when we started our unit actually years ago, we were careful to say sex and labor trafficking to really highlight that there's more than just sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is force, fraud, or coercion, but also as a means to get labor. And so that's just the general distinction. But in, I think, most people's minds, they think about, okay, well, I know what happens, the lurid details about sex trafficking. What about labor trafficking? As we're finding, labor is everywhere. It's in an otherwise lawful business or industry. It's harder to detect. And as we're getting into that, I think law enforcement and everyone is starting to think, oh, well, massage parlors. Well, is that sex or is that labor? So that seems to be the next easy step for most people to think about. And it could very well be a mixture of both. You'll have situations, it's very factual based on the victim's story. Some folks do experience both. Some experience, in the context of massage parlor, only the sex trafficking portion. Other people are also forced to do other things, also commercial sex. So the thing is, it runs the gamut. It really runs the gamut. And so when we talk about human trafficking, not to confuse it, but we need to let people know, don't automatically think about just one thing. But I will give you some examples in the past. Domestic servitude cases, like you mentioned, that was a classic type of prosecution. Or you would have basically there's a famous Guatemalan sex trafficking case coming out of LA that the US attorney prosecuted. Those are kind of the classic examples. We're advancing forward, we're hoping to find more and more types of labor trafficking where, for instance, it's in a bakery. It's hiding in plain sight and working those types of cases. And I think there's something going on. I don't know if it's California, but we seem to be a little more almost accommodating when it comes to labor trafficking. We don't think of it as big of a deal. So when you think about, hey, I see a child on the median strip selling flowers, it doesn't ring a bell for most people. They think it's okay. But if we just took the time to stop and think about it and say, well, okay, what are you doing out here? What hours are you working? It may lead you to, seeing more and realizing, oh, this child was put out here, nowhere to go, and she has to work until somebody picks her up. So those are the questions that we want to explore.
And I'd like to pivot actually for a moment, because we talked about labor trafficking, sex trafficking, the relationships and so on. I'd like to talk a little bit in a way that is often not discussed, and turn to Mary for a second. Then I want to return to talk about other programs that exist. Mary, there is right now in California a very volatile discussion around loitering, for example, with issues that are tied to whether someone who was involved in sex work is a victim or is there because of their own agency, they wish to be there, or are committing a crime, something else. In Journey Out, in your program, you deal with situations where people who've been involved in sex work claim to be non-victims at all. This is what they think they want to do. Others who are eager to recognize the victimization and are seeking help. How do you address those who say, I'm not a victim, I'm doing this by choice?
At Journey Out, we are committed to meeting people wherever they are. If someone identifies as a victim of sex trafficking, we are there to provide resources. If someone is engaged at any point in the life of commercial sexual exploitation or engaging in commercial sex, whether or not they consider themselves exploited, we are still there to provide resources. It is not our place to impugn any kind of label on anyone. It's really at up to them how they choose to identify. For us, what's important is that they get the resources that they need, that they have the assistance that they need, and that they know that they are supported no matter who they are.
So there are a number of programs, including one where you and Journey Out and in the city attorney's office work together. I want to raise that program in just a second, but I want to get Rose into the conversation first. Rose, in your role at the county, you've heard some general discussion about labor trafficking, about sex trafficking. You, of course, are also deeply involved with the business community when it comes to such issues. Give us an example of where you found success in interacting with businesses as you grapple with issues of human and sexual trafficking.
I think one of the biggest things that our department's doing is engaging in education and outreach to ensure that we deter such illegal activities. And I think employers play a significant role in that. recently, our department took on the streets in the unincorporated areas of the county and engaged with businesses to educate them on the effects of human trafficking and on the requirements of our recently adopted ordinance. And I think employers need to ensure that their workers are trained and recognize the signs of human trafficking and give them opportunities and resources as to where to report.
Actually, Rose, let me interrupt right there. Tell us 2 or 3 signs that an employer or employee in a business could be looking for that would indicate the possibility of trafficking.
I think they need to recognize the employees. They need to recognize the employee's vulnerability, whether the employee is feeling free to leave, is the employee afraid of complying with law enforcement. Oftentimes in our efforts to enforce some of our ordinances, we see that there's no compliance from the employees. And I think businesses who are doing the right thing and they have associates or businesses that they're working with to make sure that if they recognize such signs, to report and allow us the opportunity to go in and look at the business.
So let me thank you, Rose. Let me turn, as I mentioned earlier, to have An and Mary both speak to a program in which the offices of the city attorney's office, my office, and Journey Out are collaborating. So An, why don't you kick off that conversation? Tell our audience what Project Beacon is all about, and then I'll have questions for Mary about the important role Journey Out plays in that program.
Sure. So the idea behind Project Beacon, and it's a test pilot, was that it was started as a collaboration where Journey Out was allowed space within LAPD stations, 2 stations, Hollywood and Olympic. And we thought that was a wonderful opportunity for our office to be involved, to figure out, okay, if we have Journey Out, survivor advocates at the station, interfacing with potential defendants, but screening to make sure that if they are a victim, they can seek help. But unfortunately, many victims don't. And so what our office is trying to do is take that point and make sure that we maximize and leverage that point of contact. Because oftentimes, if it's LAPD out on the streets, or even our office out on the streets, as a deputy city attorney, we may not be the right contact. And especially with this population, having a survivor advocate from Journey Out is the most effective I've ever seen of trying to get that relationship going, that trust building. So Project Beacon is pre-filing. And again, you have survivor advocates who are there to screen. If they're a victim of human trafficking, there's no prosecution misdemeanor. It's all about getting them the legal services for vacatur, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But in the meanwhile, it's the supportive services. Now, the pre-filing comes in part where someone doesn't immediately self-identify, and they'll say, "Well, no, this is what I'm going through." Well, we're trying to incentivize if they engage with Journey Out and do sessions, basically self-empowerment and those supportive services, they start building that relationship at that time. Then our office doesn't file against them. So we're basically giving every opportunity to try to get folks diverted from the traditional criminal justice system and really have that chance to get them what they need. So that was the genesis of Project Beacon. And we're just so fortunate to have Journey Out as our partners.
That was a great segue. So Mary, describe what Journey Out does. Take us into a police division and put our audience in the room with Journey Out and a sex worker who has been brought in by police. Tell us what happens.
Well, our case managers are incredible, and our emergency crisis response team, they are the ones who are they're working with law enforcement directly, ready to meet anyone who comes in as a potential victim, whether they are in any way engaged in commercial sex, to again meet them where they are, let them know about the services that we offer, and really to just hear about what they need and the resources and support that they're lacking. A lot of our conversation has been about all of these different terms, victim versus versus someone who is there of their own choice. And really the terminology, we really need to, even in our conversations about distinguishing labor and sex trafficking, it's more about honing in on the exploitation factor and remembering that that these are people who have been undervalued, who have a lack of opportunity and resources, and again, really be there to fill the gap. And so at Journey Out, we do that through providing emergency clinical counseling. We provide therapy, emergency housing. We have medical advocates who actually go with clients to their doctor's appointments, and if their children need doctor's appointments, a lot of them feel unsafe in the healthcare setting, and so their needs really vary. Some of them immediately need to seek out services at a hospital. Some of them it's a place to stay for the night, and for other clients it's that they want to get home and they are in a different state from where they ended up. And so we have an approach that really is personalized and tailored to each client and each person's journey, because they are all so different.
Do you find that some of your clients, I'll refer to the folks you interact with that way, some of your clients are afraid to accept help because of violence and coercion that they've experienced on the street at the hands of people who purport to control their lives?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Trust is a huge issue. And again, that really is by standing in the gap with them. About half of our staff have lived experience in this space. And that goes a long way in terms of just having someone say, I have been in your shoes and I know what it's like to feel what you are feeling and to be in the position that you're in. I think that is a huge way that we build support and a trust. And it really is, again, not imposing any kinds of resources that maybe not sought out at the time. We have clients who come in and all they want is maybe a place to stay for the night. And if we try to get them into a more long-term residential program, if we try to get them into a job training program, it's just not going to translate if the person themselves isn't ready to accept those services or doesn't feel like they need them. This really is about enhancing people's personal agency. And our clients know that no matter if they come in and see us one time or 7 times, we know at Journey Out, for example, it takes about 7 false starts, we call them, before someone is often in a position where they really want to leave a life of commercial sex. And what that means is that in each occasion that they interact with us, it's the same in terms of being that environment that really is supportive and understanding and not trying to get them to do anything that they don't want to do and really put the power back into their hands.
Thank you, Mary. I want to get back to our friend Chauncey, but before I do, I want to ask Anna a quick question. How do you measure the success of Project Beacon?
This is an interesting question because when we launched, there were a lot of questions about why this population. And other folks said, oh, you can pick another population, you get better numbers. And for us, after talking to Journey Out, especially when my staff and I were at the station, seeing what folks were going through, sitting with LAPD, we realized this was something that just had to be done. And so for us, every person that we diverted from the criminal justice system is a win. It is something, it's significant. And each person deserves that dignity. And so for us, like Mary had mentioned, it may not be just one time, and we really don't see it as a program of one and done. This is really a chance to connect them with a lifelong kind of path of sustainable recovery. And so for us, every contact is important, and we have to focus on that quality of contact. So when you go back to the metrics, I'm sure there are other programs will try to do it, but I feel like for us, every number is significant. It's one person that we've been able to tangibly affect. And again, they may come back, but the fact that they've established this relationship, I hear all the time where folks will pull Journey Out aside and say, "Hey, here's my real cell phone number," meaning that they're not being straightforward even with their contact information, and that they will only trust certain people. But those are good signs for me, and I value to work in this area.
We're going to return. Go ahead, Mary. Go ahead.
Oh, that the relationship piece that An mentioned is so crucial, and in terms of building that over time, and that's really what our empowerment groups are geared towards. So our clients meet with our case managers, a lot of whom, like I said, have lived experience in this space, and they're able to speak with one another, and in a setting, if they feel comfortable, the classes, the empowerment groups can also be one-on-one with a case manager, but having that space, that dedicated time week after week, if they're open to that, goes a long way in terms of really creating this environment of continual communication and a desire to actually engage.
Thank you, Mary. And actually, this is, Chauncey, a good way to transition to some of your work. I think sometimes this discussion can get a little abstract for the viewer who's watching this show. I'd like you to take it down to the level of real life. Talk to us about a victim of trafficking with whom you and your program have worked, what the problem was in the first place, what she had been going through, and success, and what success looked like.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, we've been at this work for now 27 years, starting with the famous El Monte tie garment slavery case in 1995, where we were part of the multi-agency task force that went into that slavery compound and liberated 72 Thai men and women who were forced into slavery and debt peonage in a makeshift garment factory. Unfortunately, that was just the tip of the iceberg. And since then, we've worked on many more cases. Thais are disproportionately affected by this heinous crime. And so that began then Thai CC's Traffic Victim Services back in 1995. And we essentially come in and provide immediate emergency relief and resettlement assistance, providing the immediate housing and shelter, food and basic supplies and what have you. But while we secure their safety and make sure that their welfare is attended to, because we want them to overcome the trauma of their ordeal. We also recognize that these are individuals who can be powerful forces for change. We have seen in the course of working with victims and survivors since 1995, and from a number of large cases involving victims of both labor and sex trafficking who happen to be Thai foreign nationals, that they initially, when we make contact with them, would be timid and voiceless and unaware, totally unaware of their rights. They're coming a lot of times from the poorer parts of Thailand with very little in the way of educational attainment and have no idea what their rights are, and thought that that this is their lot in life to have been exploited and put in this situation because of some karmic retribution for whatever they've done in their past life, and so they have to resign themselves. And so this kind of fatalistic attitude is something that we have to help them overcome first and foremost, and help them understand that they do have rights. They could assert those rights, and they could pursue justice and see that achieved as well. And so then. We then help them become material witnesses in the criminal prosecution of their traffickers, prepare them for that. And we also find ways to get them the redress and restitution they need through civil cases, legal cases that by civil means, because we believe in the civil means and criminal means of justice. And so once we have this relationship of trust, they are willing to, and then we help them overcome the language and cultural barriers. Then they're willing to open up, they're willing to participate and cooperate in the prosecution, they're willing to fight for justice, and then they we get them employed and try to get to a path of self-sufficiency. And once they're at that point, then they feel empowered enough to really then start becoming advocates. And we train them in public speaking, and they testify before legislature, and then they end up going through this very transformative process from victims to change agents and become this powerful force for change. And so we've seen that occurring, and it's been very inspiring. They are now, a lot of them, very independent, productive individuals leading productive lives. They have gone on to start up businesses, to become leading advocates for immigrant rights, workers' rights, and human rights. And so, yeah.
Those are major successes. I mean,
yeah,
and Rose, Chauncey referred to what life is like for some members of the Thai community as they get victimized by trafficking. I want to say, when I was a law student 40 years ago, my first summer job was at a law firm in Bangkok. And I remember being taken down a street, his name is Pat Pong, which I'll remember vividly, and being shown business, if we can call it that, after business, where you walk in and there's a glass wall. On one side of the glass wall is the customer. On the other side of the glass wall were chairs with girls and women with numbers around their necks. And the customer's role was to state a number, and that would signify his choice of which of these women or girls would be his for that period of time for which he was paying. And I was told that the women and girls behind those glass walls typically come from very impoverished families in the farming communities of Thailand. And this is where they are, for many of the reasons that Chauncey just articulated. Picture being the parent of one of those women or girls. And Rose, this leads me to you. I referred to the customer in that dynamic I just described. In your role in the county, can you help let consumers know what not only their rights and responsibilities are in these settings, but also what constructive role they can play in helping put a stop to trafficking, be it labor or sex trafficking, especially if they put themselves in the shoes of that parent of that woman, that girl, that victim of trafficking? Please.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And I think you said it well. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the parent, or imagine that that person is your loved one. I think just the general public needs to be aware of the signs of trafficking. As An mentioned earlier, you may see a little girl or a family on the corner of the street selling flowers. Oftentimes we think about, let's support them, let's buy flowers from them, but are you really supporting them or hurting them more? So be aware of those signs, look out for them. If you suspect suspicious business activity, just report them. You can contact different law enforcement, including our agency, and report anonymously. We have tools to deter, and I think all of us here have tools to deter such illegal activity. My biggest, advice to the public is never turn a blind eye, even if you feel it's just a suspicion, because you may be saving a life. The girls that you just mentioned, I think, they're in a position where they can get hurt. So let's save a life. Don't turn a blind eye. Contact us. We all have resources. We have a website dedicated to resources we have in LA County. And please just report it to any law enforcement. That's my advice to the public.
Rose, do you have any example of a time when a consumer reported something that proved to be useful in pursuing a trafficking matter?
Absolutely. Just to note that LA County is working with our treasurer and tax collector to ensure that businesses who are seeking licensure in the massage establishments are in compliance with worker protection. So when working on some of those referrals from treasurer and tax collector, we received a tip from a wife of a customer that went to the massage establishment. In fact, she found the number to the massage establishment in the husband's wallet. She confronted the husband. The husband did not say anything, so she contacted the massage establishment to find out that they do not accept female customers. Based on her tip, we went to the massage establishment and actually found that there was sex trafficking going on there. So any reporting, any hunch or suspicion is really helpful for us.
Thank you for sharing that. Mary wanted to say something, I can tell, and then I want to ask Anna a question. Mary, go ahead.
I just wanted to echo everything that Rose is saying about the importance of really reporting things. In 2019, Polaris reported that 40% of human trafficking cases were referred by friends and family, which again just shows how important it is for us all to be speaking up and looking out for warning signs, not just out, everywhere we are, whether it be with the loved ones close to us and out in the community. And I can say even from, the local and national hotline that we have on posters that have gone out through the city attorney's office as a result of that. I can give you an example, of multiple cases. One that comes to mind is a client, a 19-year-old female client. I'll call her India, and she was actually run over by her trafficker. When our team member met her, she was in a wheelchair, and she was referred to us, from the hotline, and we were able to place her into a safe housing situation, help her with getting basic needs, clothing, hygiene, food, and helping her with her medical appointments and survivor mentorship, of course, as well. She's going to continue to need care, but as a result of the hotline and having those resources easily accessible, as people share it more, as people know that resource is out there, it is getting to clients and to those in need so that they can connect with service providers like us and like Thai CDC for help.
Thank you, Mary. So I want to ask you a question with a preface. I want to talk to you about vacature, which is a term that none of our audience members knows. So we're going to describe what that means in a moment. But Mary used to be a prosecutor. You are a prosecutor. I'm sure there are viewers who are asking, why is a prosecutor's office not prosecuting in the case of the people who participate in Project Beacon, but instead seeking services for people who have violated the law by behavior in which they've engaged, which is why the police have picked them up in the first place. Before we discuss what vacature means, tell us from your perspective the value from a prosecutor's standpoint in having a program like Project Beacon.
So I think the typical prosecutor's job is really there are laws and we enforce laws. And so law enforcement, LAPD, will arrest people for violating laws, and we make the case because we represent the people of the state of California. The laws were broken. I think the turning point for commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking is that we got it wrong. That basically there were victims that basically went through and were prosecuted because we didn't know better. They didn't self-identify. The information didn't come out. But I think there's an expansion of understanding that folks were going through their process. And so they were not in a place where they felt safe to tell us, hey, actually, I'm doing this because somebody is behind me, forcing me to do this. Or maybe they, again, some folks identify it's my boyfriend when it's a trafficker. But basically, what we are now seeing is, okay, now here's an opportunity to set the record straight. You were forced during that period of time to commit a crime. So I think since prosecutors, at the end of the day, we seek justice. We don't seek prosecutions just to say, and Mary is nodding her head, we don't seek prosecutions just to say we prosecuted. We seek justice. And so that very important question turns us back to, did we get it wrong? Can we right that? And so if there's something pending before our courtrooms, there's a pending case, we need to know immediately, should we proceed with any prosecution? Vacature, if we want to jump a little ahead, is the process that the law recognizes that you were a victim during the time that you were forced to commit whatever crime it is. And so it's trying to undo and trying to wipe the slate clean to allow folks to go back and petition the court and say, actually, I was arrested, I was convicted of this crime, but I was forced to do it. I was a victim actually during that time. And if they meet the requirements, the court can wipe that slate clean and say, we make a finding that you were a victim of human trafficking, we will clear your records, and now you won't have that on your record as an obstacle when you seek employment, when you want to go get licenses or go to schooling. So that to us is a very important extension of the seeking justice. And to me, while it seems a little odd to talk about prosecutors and vacature, we're there to effectuate justice. And that's why we love to collaborate with other legal service providers. And we spearheaded a group actually that involved the public defenders, the district attorney's office, court administrators, other legal service providers, just to sit down and talk about the state statute that allowed it, because people didn't understand it. Clerks were rejecting filings as they didn't know what it was. Judges didn't know what they were. One of my first cases, I was there with another attorney, and we have to convince the judge that, yes, you are allowed to do this. This is what the statute says. We provided the declarations and the sufficient evidence that you need to order the relief. And so it's very important work, but I was so proud that it required the hard work of everyone sitting at the table and setting aside their historical experiences with other agencies and just get down to how do we help the victim. And that led to the creation of a specialized court that will accept petitions for all of LA County for all purposes. And that was the first of its kind in the state. So that's the work.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in discussions about this program and other similar programs, the principle of justice that you cited is very important. But also many of our viewers are concerned about how it relates to making their streets safer and improving the quality of life in their neighborhoods. You've said many times that when you turn around the life of someone who has been involved in commercial sex and she's engaged in a productive, legitimate line of work, she's not going to repeat her offenses in the future. And as a consequence, there'll be fewer crimes committed by that person down the road, and the community is better off, which I know, because I think that a lot of these discussions, Chauncey, I want to turn to you, ought not focus exclusively on issues, however important they are, of ideals and principle. Right now, in our community, people are very concerned about the raw daily impact of violations of law and how that's going to change because they don't want their community to be pervaded with it. And these programs have a direct connection to that. And I wanted to ask you, Chauncey, there is increasing public awareness around these issues, but I would bet that at the Thai CDC, for example, that you would like more public attention brought to these issues. Tell us why and what strategies you hope to employ to expand public awareness.
Oh, absolutely. We've been trying to raise public awareness around this scourge of human trafficking for 27 years. After the Omonte case, that kind of woke the world up to this new global phenomenon known as human trafficking. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, it was just the tip of the iceberg, because then we found ourselves coming to the aid of thousands more victims, labor trafficking victims, sex trafficking victims, until this day. This issue continues to grow unabated. Sadly, it's now a third in terms of the billions of dollars made from the trafficking of human beings and persons after drug trafficking, after arms trafficking, and it's not stopping. It's growing, in fact, and so it becomes incumbent and even I have to implore people, it becomes incumbent on them to really recognize the signs and do your duty and due diligence to find ways of how to actually then tip law enforcement off or service providers off, and so we do that by providing a lot of education. So when we co-founded the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, it was a three-pronged approach. This was back in '98. It was to first provide and create a continuum of care network by training service providers on how to serve victims in a way that's trauma-informed and victim-centered. And then the second prong was training also law enforcement and making sure that they, upon encountering victims are not criminalized and are being aided by service providers and are referred to by service providers. And then the other prong is this policy advocacy piece to fight for changes in the laws that protect victims that led to Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed by Congress in 2000, which we used to remedy, to provide immigration relief and remedy the immigration status of the victims. And then the last prong is education, awareness, and then when we realized that this is a growing crisis in the larger Asian Pacific Islander community, where the victims from Asian countries are here, but not being able to access services because of the language and cultural barriers. We needed these API community-based organizations to also be trained in terms of serving the victims in language and then educating their respective communities that this exists in their community and how to detect them and the trafficking victims and how to bring them the aid they need, them to safety and all of that. And so hence we founded the API Human Trafficking Task Force, of which your office is part of. And we got funded by U.S. Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime as the lead agency. Yeah, to provide that immediate services, the social services, the counseling, the legal services, and then to do all the education advocacy in the communities in multiple languages.
Well, actually, I was going to say, Chauncey, just really quickly, as time is getting a little short here, I wanted to go back to Rose because, Chauncey's focused, among other things, on language competency in terms of outreach that's conducted. You work with the business community. I'm interested in knowing the degree to which you're finding increased cooperation among business leaders. If not, what you think the impediments are, and in particular, whether your outreach is focused on businesses that cater to API customers more than other businesses that might focus on other communities because of the prevalence of trafficking that Chauncey just mentioned in the API communities.
Thank you for that question. We are, as some of you may know, we have adopted an ordinance that's really, the intent is to prevent human trafficking in the county. And I think we not only interface with businesses, but we also interface with the victims. One of the ways that we're attempting to educate the businesses is by going door to door, as I mentioned previously. We do see, based on our experience, we do see violations across different communities. But we are seeking the assistance of some of the community-based organizations like Chance's organization and Mary's organization that's going to really help us create that safe space to get the information out. One of the really interesting things about our ordinance is that it mandates businesses to provide education and training to their employees to recognize the signs of human trafficking and where to report. So we're hoping that will empower some of the victims to come forward and report anonymously. Some of the impediments that we face with businesses when we're trying to educate them is that oftentimes those businesses that we believe are in violation, we cannot find the owners. We cannot find the people that are behind it. They often use just faces, and it's difficult not only to educate, but it's difficult to enforce. And oftentimes when we're in there to enforce, they will shut down and open under a different name. So we're hoping to engage with different community organizations. We're also engaging with consulates to ensure that we get the information out in the right communities to the people and really inform them of the worker protections that we have in Los Angeles County.
And by the way, are you finding that the consuls general, let me take a step back, for our viewers, nations around the world have ambassadors who are in Washington, D.C. They're representatives at the United Nations, but they also have locations from which they serve in major cities across the United States. And here in Los Angeles, we have consuls general representing nations from all over the world. Many of those consul general used to be ambassadors to other nations. Are you finding that the representatives of other nations, the consul general, are effective partners? And how would you want to enhance those partnerships?
I certainly think that they're effective partners. And I think the way I would like to enhance is to train the staff at the consul general to ensure that when they have clients coming in seeking the consulate services, that they can recognize when there is a victim of trafficking, that they can recognize if there is a victim of wage theft, because we often know when there's trafficking in a workplace, there's also other workplace violations. So to really understand what the resources are and assist us in getting the community to the right places. And I think it's just a safe space for reporting, because us as the government and an enforcement program, it's really difficult to get compliance by the victims, by the communities. They are seeking that assistance from people that speak their own language, from people that they feel safe to report. And I think it's important that we engage with different communities and ensure that the information is out there for the people that need it the most.
Thank you, Rose. So this
if I could add just
Chauncey,
really
please.
quickly that, yeah, we work very closely with the Royal Thai Consulate, and they can refer cases to us that they have in the past when victims had been discovered or they escaped their situation, their own, and they go to report this to consulate. We immediately get a call directly on my cell phone from like the consul general telling me that we have this case and we'd like to refer over to Thai CDC. And we're also in communication with the Thai ambassador in DC, and he has really applauded the work that we've been doing, because one of the things that Thailand's trying to do is really combat this problem. And so they are very supportive of our efforts, and they really work in concert with us.
Thank you, Chauncey. In fact, now I'd like to turn to each of you for a final word in a couple sentences. Are there facets of this issue that we haven't had a chance to highlight that you think our viewers need to know about? Mary.
One thing that people really need to know is the fact that there are male victims of labor and sex trafficking, and that, you know, we need to recognize that victims are across the gamut in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, and really take note of each and every one of them, and not, you know, make distinctions based on these factors. I think that's largely left out of conversations often, and again, just the importance of really being aware of the exploitation factor and not getting too hung up on, you know, labels, because even when you look at the distinction between labor and sex trafficking, as we've talked about, there is merging, and while you may have a labor trafficking victim who is not being trafficked specifically for sex, they can still be experiencing sexual sexual assault and other crimes that, you know, so the lines that we draw between these things are often arbitrary a little bit in terms of when we look at the big picture of what exploitation really is, and also including facets of that when it comes to children in foster care, for example. That's a huge nexus that we see. The fact that, you know, at Journey Out, for example, over 90% of our clients have a history of child sexual abuse or incest, and so again, it's being aware of key factors that lead to exploitation, and just taking note of, you know, a situation on the whole instead of trying to put someone into a box, because again, services and support really need to address a whole person, and you can't do that if you're trying to limit them.
An array of very important insights. Antrong.
One thing that most viewers here, if you're a parent talking how to talk about this with kids, how to be aware of what your children are up to is a huge concern. And so we would recommend folks to check out the LA County Office of Education. They have a specialized program geared around kind of the youth issues, and they are partners with one of our favorite organizations, I Empathize, for training on both the sex trafficking and the labor trafficking. So we urge folks to really educate yourselves on that. And I think other viewers may wonder, well, ultimately, what can I do? We go back to that question. And I want to present two very quick examples. One is a missed chance. We had a domestic servitude case years ago where the only time the person was allowed off-site was they were in a trunk of a car brought to a church, and they were allowed to go to church. And then they would come back and be brought back. And I always wondered the missed chance of somebody sitting in church going, hey, you're new. I haven't seen you, starting some sort of conversation and catching it earlier. So that's the missed opportunity. The other one that was successful was a woman who happened to frequent a restaurant and noticed a 12-year-old working at the restaurant when it was during school hours. And over time, just starting a conversation, who is it? Oh, this is not your family. This is not, ended up the girl was sold from El Salvador, basically to owners who then put her in forced labor. So these are very concrete examples of things that are right in our midst. And if you pay attention and start a conversation, you may see this.
Thank you, An. Rose, last word?
I think people need to know that there are resources out there. There are services that are offered, and for victims, don't be afraid that you don't have an immigration status here. We don't care about that. We're here to help you. Please take advantage of the resources that are available.
Thank you, Rose. Chauncey, 30 seconds.
I just want to say that there's power in bringing about social change when the survivors are the ones leading the fight to combat human trafficking, because it's really through their courage, strength, and perseverance that can bring about real change in the U.S. It is this work that we do on behalf of trafficking victims that often constitutes the true social change work, because it's by fighting trafficking and slavery that we challenge all underlying cultural values which govern the relations between genders and social classes. So
I'd like to thank a remarkable panel for a poignant and provocative conversation on an issue that doesn't get as much airtime as other issues do in today's society, but on the streets of our city and our county, to the families of the victims, this is the issue. So I want to underscore my gratitude to all our panelists today. Thank you, and underscore to members of the public who are watching the roles that you can play to help put a stop to trafficking, whether it be labor or sex trafficking. Recognize those victims deserve respect and dignity and have lives that can be very productive if only you help. Thanks very much.